My life was a grid, a carefully curated collection of straight lines and right angles, of predictable schedules and muted colors. I was a graphic designer, and I had designed my own existence to be clean, minimalist, and above all, safe. From my apartment, where every book was alphabetized and every mug handle faced east, to my career, where I translated the chaos of a client's vision into the sterile order of a vector file, I craved control. I had built walls, not of brick and mortar, but of routine and emotional distance. And from behind their safety, I observed the world like a visitor in a museum, admiring the exhibits but never daring to touch. Liam Sterling was the most magnificent exhibit of all. He was my client, an architect who had recently broken away from a major firm to start his own bespoke practice. He hired me to create his brand identity, a task that involved weekly meetings in my sterile, white-walled office. Those meetings became the one disruption I willingly allowed in my grid. He was a paradox of a man, a creator of rigid structures who seemed to exist with an effortless, fluid grace. He was tall, with shoulders that spoke of manual labor, not just sketching blueprints. His hair was the color of dark coffee, perpetually a little messy, as if he'd just run his hands through it while wrestling with a complex design. But it was his presence that truly undid me. When Liam entered a room, the very air seemed to settle. He moved with a quiet confidence that I, in my constant state of low-grade anxiety, found both intimidating and deeply alluring. His voice was a low, calm rumble, a sound like stones shifting at the bottom of a river. It was a voice that could soothe frayed nerves or, as I often found, create a whole new kind of tension deep in my gut. He would lean over my desk to look at a design, and I would be enveloped in his scent, a clean, sharp fragrance of cedar and something vaguely like fresh rain on pavement. I would have to consciously remind my lungs to keep working. He was, of course, completely unattainable. The professional boundary was a chasm between us, a line as clear and unforgiving as any I could draw an illustrator. Beyond that, he existed in a world I could only imagine, a world of sophisticated dinner parties and weekend trips with, presumably, a beautiful, elegant woman who appreciated architecture and the scent of cedar. He wore his life as comfortably as his worn leather watch, a life that had no space for a man who cataloged his anxieties and color-coded his sock drawer. He was a masterpiece of classical sculpture, and I was the quiet, nervous guard hired to make sure no one got too close. So I admired him from a distance, from across the polished surface of my conference table. I memorized the way a stray lock of hair fell across his forehead when he was concentrating, the network of fine lines that appeared around his eyes when he smiled, a rare and brilliant event. I learned the specific cadence of his footsteps in the hallway. I collected these small, insignificant details and stored them away like precious artifacts. My feelings for him became another ordered thing in my life. A secret, neatly filed away under impossible. It was a quiet, manageable ache, a part of the routine. I would feel the familiar pang of yearning during our meetings, and then I would go home, put on my noise-canceling headphones, and meticulously design the clean, empty life he could never be a part of. The walls were high. They were supposed to be. They were safe. I never expected that a simple project would bring a storm strong enough to wash them all away. The project was a portfolio book, a high-end, coffee table monolith meant to showcase his new firm's philosophy. He wanted it to feel personal, authentic. "I don't want sterile shots of empty rooms, Elias," he had said, his deep voice filling the quiet of my office. "I want to capture the soul of the spaces." His prize project, the one he wanted as the centerpiece, was a cabin he designed and built himself, nestled deep in the mountains a few hours from the city. He described it as his sanctuary, the physical manifestation of his architectural beliefs. "The photographer is booked for the weekend after next," he explained, leaning forward, his hands clasped on my table. The posture was casual, but his gaze was direct, and it made my heart perform a nervous little tap dance against my ribs. "I was thinking, it might be beneficial for you to be there. To see the place. To feel it. It would inform the layout, the whole tactile experience of the book." My mind, my fortress of logic and order, immediately began constructing a list of reasons why this was a terrible idea. The disruption to my schedule. The awkwardness of spending a weekend with a client. The sheer, terrifying proximity to him outside the controlled environment of our weekly meetings. My mouth, however, seemed to be operating on a different system entirely. Yes, it said, with an absurd amount of calm. That makes sense. I'd like that. Liam smiled, and the effect was like the sun breaking through a month of overcast skies. It was warm and genuine, reaching all the way to his eyes. Great. I'll drive. We can head up Friday afternoon. The photographer gets there Saturday morning, and we'll come back Sunday. The plan was simple. It was logical. It was work. But as I watched him leave, the clean lines of my world began to feel blurry at the edges. A weekend. 2 nights. Trapped in a remote cabin with the one person who could dismantle my carefully constructed reality with a single smile. My anxiety, usually a low hum, began to crescendo. It was a terrible, wonderful, terrifying idea, and it was already happening. The week leading up to the trip was a blur of nervous energy. I triple-checked my gear, packed and repacked my bag, and rehearsed neutral conversation topics in my head while kerning typefaces. I felt like I was preparing for an expedition to a foreign planet, not a 2-hour drive to the mountains. The forecast had mentioned a storm system moving in late Friday, but the reports were inconsistent. A little rain, maybe some wind. Nothing to worry about. Nothing that would derail the carefully structured itinerary. When Friday arrived, I was waiting outside my building, my bag clutched in my hand like a shield. Liam pulled up in a dark, sturdy-looking truck that seemed as solid and dependable as he was. He leaned over to open the passenger door, and that smile hit me again. Ready to leave the grid behind? He asked, a teasing glint in his eye. The question was so unnervingly perceptive that I could only nod, my voice deserting me. The drive was easier than I'd feared. Liam was a calm driver, his large hands resting easily on the steering wheel. He put on a playlist of quiet, instrumental music that filled the space without demanding attention. We talked about work, about the project, the conversation staying firmly within the safe, professional lines I knew so well. Yet, I was hyper-aware of everything. The way the setting sun caught the silver in the stubble on his jaw, the scent of his cologne, a subtle note of sandalwood and something green, mingling with the clean air of the truck's cabin. The sheer space he occupied, a solid, warm presence just a few feet away from me. I felt like a compass needle, pulled irresistibly toward true north. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the sky began to change. The pale blue of the afternoon bruised into a deep, moody gray. The wind picked up, rocking the truck in sudden, violent gusts. The first drops of rain hit the windshield, fat and heavy. "Looks like that storm is coming in a little faster than they thought," Liam said, his voice as calm as ever, but his eyes were now focused, scanning the darkening road ahead. The rain quickly became a deluge, a solid sheet of water that the wipers fought a losing battle against. The world outside the truck dissolved into a wash of gray and green. We turned off the main highway onto a gravel road that wound deeper into the woods. The trees crowded in, their branches thrashing in the wind. It felt like we had left the known world behind and entered some ancient, wilder place. Finally, through the downpour, I saw it. The cabin was perched on a small rise, a structure of dark wood and glass that seemed to have grown organically from the landscape. It was beautiful, all clean lines and sharp angles, yet it looked perfectly at home in the surrounding chaos of the storm. Liam killed the engine, and the sudden silence was broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof and the howl of the wind. "Welcome to the sanctuary," he said, his voice a low rumble. We made a mad dash for the door, but we were soaked in seconds. Inside, the cabin was a haven of warmth and quiet. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and the main room was open, with a soaring ceiling and a wall of windows that looked out into the storm-tossed forest. The air smelled of pine, sawdust, and rain. It smelled like him. He showed me to the guest room, a simple, comfortable space with a large bed and a window looking out at the dripping ferns. "Get settled in," he said. "I'll get a fire going." I stood there for a long time after he left, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet sounds of him moving around in the main room. The professional boundary had dissolved the moment we'd stepped out of his truck. We were two people in a box, surrounded by a roaring wilderness. The grid was gone. My carefully drawn lines had been washed away by the rain, and a new, terrifying, and exhilarating map was being drawn, one with no clear path and a destination I couldn't possibly predict. The storm was relentless. It threw itself against the cabin with a primal fury, the wind shrieking through the pines like a living thing. But inside, there was a profound sense of safety. Liam had built this place with his own hands, and it felt impregnable, a fortress of warmth and light against the chaos. The fire he'd started now roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the wood-paneled walls and filling the room with a flickering, golden light. The scent of burning oak mingled with the smell of damp earth and pine. We fell into a strange, domestic rhythm. Liam cooked dinner, moving around the small, efficient kitchen with an unhurried grace that I envied. I sat at the large wooden island, ostensibly to keep him company, but mostly I just watched. I watched the confident economy of his movements as he chopped vegetables, the way the firelight caught the strong column of his throat when he tilted his head. He asked me questions about my life outside of work, simple things about where I grew up, my family, what I liked to do when I wasn't obsessing over kerning and color palettes. The questions were gentle, disarming, and I found myself answering with a candor that surprised me. The walls I kept so meticulously maintained began to feel porous. He spoke a little about himself, too. He talked about the immense pressure and toxicity of his old firm, the soulless glass towers they designed for corporate giants. I felt like I was building expensive, empty boxes, he said, his back to me as he stirred a pot on the stove. His voice was quiet, tinged with a weariness I'd never heard before. This was the antidote. I needed to build something real, something that had a relationship with the land it stood on, something with a soul. It was the first crack I had ever seen in his confident facade, a glimpse of the vulnerability beneath the self-assured architect. He wasn't a museum piece. He was a man who had felt lost and had built his own way back. My admiration, once a distant, aesthetic appreciation, began to deepen into something warmer, more complex, something dangerously close to empathy. We ate at a large dining table he'd also built, the surface smooth and solid beneath my elbows. The food was simple, a hearty stew, but it tasted like the best meal I had ever had. Outside, the storm howled its approval. The conversation flowed easily, moving from architecture to music to travel. We discovered a shared love for old black and white films and a mutual disdain for minimalist art that lacked humanity. For the first time, I felt like I was talking to Liam, the man, not Mr. Sterling, the client. I felt seen. And with that feeling came a heightened awareness that was almost painful. Every small detail was amplified. The way his knee accidentally brushed against mine under the table, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of pure electricity through my entire body. The low rumble of his laugh, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my own chest. The intensity in his dark eyes, softened by the firelight, when he would hold my gaze for just a second too long. The space between us felt charged, humming with an unspoken energy that was both terrifying and intoxicating. I was so far off my grid, I couldn't even remember what a straight line looked like. After dinner, we were clearing the plates when the world plunged into absolute darkness. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died, taking the low hum of the refrigerator with them. The only light and sound left were from the fire and the storm. A sudden, profound silence fell between us. "Well," Liam's voice came out of the blackness, startlingly close. "Guess that's that. Power's out." I could hear the smile in his voice. He didn't sound concerned at all. He sounded content. He moved past me, a shadow eclipsing the firelight for a moment, and came back with a handful of candles. He lit them and placed them around the room, and the cabin was transformed. The shadows grew longer, deeper. The world shrank to the small, intimate circle of warm light we occupied. We sat on the thick rug in front of the fireplace, the silence stretching between us, but it was no longer awkward. It was a comfortable, weighted silence. He was leaning against the sofa, and I was a few feet away, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. I could hear his breathing, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to sync with the beating of my own heart. I was acutely aware of him, of every shift in his weight, every quiet sigh. My own body was thrumming with a nervous energy, a mix of fear and a desperate, aching want. This was the most dangerous place I had ever been. Not because of the storm, but because for the first time in my life, I felt the desperate urge to tear down my own walls, brick by painful brick. The heat from the fire was intense, a dry, penetrating warmth that soaked into my clothes and skin. It made the cabin feel smaller, the air thicker. After helping Liam earlier to secure a loose shutter outside in the lashing rain, my muscles had begun to ache with the unfamiliar exertion. A deep soreness settled into my shoulders and back. I stretched, trying to work out the knots, and let out a small, involuntary groan of discomfort. Liam shifted beside me. His voice, when he spoke, was a low murmur that barely rose above the crackling of the logs. "You okay?" "Just sore," I admitted, my voice sounding thin to my own ears. Not used to fighting with hurricane-force winds. He was quiet for a moment. The firelight played across the strong lines of his face, making his expression unreadable. "This place has a solution for that," he said slowly, as if weighing his words. "There's a tub, an old clawfoot. The water heater is propane, so it still works." He paused. "A hot soak would probably help." The suggestion hung in the air between us. It was practical. It was considerate. But in the charged atmosphere of the candlelit cabin, it felt like something more. An offering. An invitation into a more private part of his sanctuary. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, panicked bird. "Yeah," I managed to say, my throat suddenly dry. That sounds really good." He led the way with a candle, his broad back a moving silhouette against the flickering light. The bathroom was at the end of a short hall. It was a simple, beautiful room, all slate tile and dark wood. And in the center of it was the tub he'd mentioned, a deep, white basin on ornate iron feet. It looked big enough for two. I immediately banished the thought, my cheeks flushing with heat that had nothing to do with the fire. "Towels are in the cabinet," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the tiled room. He placed the candle on the wide wooden vanity. "Take your time. There's no rush." His eyes met mine in the dim light, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. There was a question in his gaze, something deep and searching that I couldn't decipher. Then he was gone, pulling the door almost closed behind him, leaving me alone in the warm, flickering darkness. I filled the tub, the sound of the rushing water loud in the quiet house. Steam rose, carrying the faint, clean scent of the soap that sat on a small wooden dish. It was his soap, cedar and pine. I stripped off my clothes, my hands shaking slightly, and sank into the scalding water with a sigh. The heat was a blissful shock, instantly beginning to soothe my aching muscles. I leaned my head back against the cool porcelain, closed my eyes, and just breathed. For a few minutes, there was only the sound of the storm, the distant crackle of the fire, and the gentle lapping of the water against the sides of the tub. My anxiety began to recede, replaced by a heavy, languid calm. I was safe. I was warm. But I was also exquisitely aware of Liam on the other side of the door. The physical barrier of the door felt laughably thin, no match for the palpable connection that had been building between us all evening. I must have been in the water for 20 minutes when a soft knock came at the door. My eyes snapped open. My heart resumed its frantic rhythm. "Elias." Liam's voice was low, muffled by the wood. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," I called back, my voice tight. "It's great. Thank you." There was a pause. I heard him shift on the other side of the door. "There's still plenty of hot water," he said, his voice careful, measured. Another pause, this one stretching into an eternity. My entire body was frozen, waiting. "Is there room for one more?" The question was quiet, but it landed in the silent room with the force of a thunderclap. It was direct. It was unambiguous. It was a step across a line I never thought would be approached, let alone crossed. The air left my lungs in a rush. Fear warred with a hope so fierce it was painful. This was it, the point of no return. My meticulously ordered life was a distant memory, a photograph of a stranger. This was real. This was chaos. And I wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything. "Yes," I breathed, the word a ghost of a sound. "There's room." The door opened slowly. Liam stood framed in the doorway, silhouetted by the firelight from the main room. He was holding a candle, the small flame illuminating the serious, almost vulnerable expression on his face. He said nothing as he stepped inside and quietly closed the door, plunging the room back into the intimate glow of the single candle on the vanity. He moved without any of his earlier casualness, his actions deliberate, almost reverent. He undressed in the shadows, and all I could hear was the soft rustle of fabric. Then, His form emerged from the darkness, and he lowered himself into the water at the opposite end of the tub. The water level rose dramatically, sloshing against the sides. The space, which had felt generous moments before, was now filled with his presence. His knees brushed against mine under the water, a searing point of contact that grounded me in the unbelievable reality of the moment. He was here, with me. The steam rose around us, creating a soft focus haze, blurring the edges of the world. The only thing that felt sharp and real was him. He leaned his head back, mirroring my posture, and let out a long, slow breath. His eyes were closed. The candlelight carved his features out of the shadows, the strong line of his jaw, the curve of his throat, the powerful muscles of his shoulders and chest, slick with water. I watched a single drop of condensation trace a path from his collarbone down his sternum, and I felt a pang of such intense, desperate longing that it was hard to breathe. For a long time, we just sat there in the shared heat and silence. The storm outside seemed to have quieted, its rage spent, leaving only the gentle patter of rain against the roof. The world had shrunk to this single, steamy, sacred space. I could feel the steady, rhythmic pulse of his heartbeat through the water, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to call to my own. Finally, he opened his eyes. They were dark and deep in the candlelight, and they were fixed on me. "Elias," he said, and my name on his lips was a physical thing, a touch. He shifted, the water swirling around us, and reached a hand out, letting it rest on my knee. His touch was warm, firm, and utterly grounding. It wasn't tentative. It was a statement. "I'm glad you're here." My carefully constructed world had not just been disrupted, it had been utterly and beautifully demolished. The museum guard had abandoned his post. The exhibit had stepped off its pedestal, and I was no longer observing my life from behind a wall. I was in it, under the water, in the heart of the storm, with him, and I had never felt more terrified or more at home. The morning after was a study in silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and startlingly quiet. Sunlight, thin and pale, filtered through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and a distinct chill had settled in the cabin. The power was still out. The intimacy of the night before, cocooned in darkness and steam, felt like a dream. In the harsh light of day, it felt like a transgression. An immense, suffocating awkwardness descended. We moved around each other in the kitchen, making coffee on the gas stove, with a careful, deliberate distance. We were two celestial bodies that had strayed too close, now caught in a new and uncomfortable orbit, terrified of colliding again. We avoided eye contact. Our conversation was clipped, functional. "Pass the sugar. Do you want this mug?" Each polite, sterile phrase felt like a brick being placed back onto the wall between us. My mind, my old and treacherous friend, went into overdrive. The anxiety I had kept at bay flooded back in, a cold, relentless tide. The overthinking began, a vicious spiral of doubt and self-recrimination. He regretted it. Of course, he regretted it. It was a fluke, a moment of cabin fever brought on by the storm and the darkness. I had misread everything. He had been offering a simple, kind gesture, a bath for a sore guest, and I had loaded it with all my pathetic, secret yearning. My quiet yes had been too eager. My presence in that tub had been an imposition. I replayed the entire night, searching for clues, for evidence of my mistake. His quietness now seemed like a clear verdict. He was distant, his brow furrowed in a way that I now interpreted as regret, not contemplation. He was building his walls back up, higher and stronger than before, and I had been the fool who thought, for one night, that they might come down. The professional line I had worried so much about had been crossed, and now it was ruined. I hadn't just made a fool of myself. I had potentially destroyed a working relationship with my most important client. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest and making it hard to breathe. We ate breakfast in near silence. The only sounds the clinking of spoons against ceramic bowls and the drip of water from the eaves outside. I stared into my oatmeal as if it held the answers to the universe. I could feel his gaze on me occasionally, but I couldn't bring myself to look up and meet it. What would I see? Pity? Annoyance? Disgust? It was better not to know. It was better to retreat back into the safety of my own head. even if it was a torture chamber of my own making. The chasm between us, which for a few hours had vanished, now felt wider and more impassable than ever before. I had been given a glimpse of connection, only to have it snatched away, leaving me colder and more alone than I had been before. After breakfast, he pulled on a jacket and boots. "I'm going to go check for damage outside," he said, his voice flat. "See if any trees are down on the road." He didn't invite me to join him. He didn't even look at me as he said it. He just walked out, the closing of the door echoing in the silent cabin like a gunshot. I was left alone with the dying embers and my spiraling thoughts. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to ward off a chill that came from within. The joy and hope that had bloomed in my chest the night before had withered, leaving a bitter ache. It was my own fault. I always knew he was unattainable. I was the one who had dared to touch the art. And now, I had to face the consequences. This cold, silent gallery, where I was once again the lonely, invisible guard. I just wanted to go home, back to my grid, back to my orderly, predictable solitude, where the only heart I could break was my own. He was gone for what felt like an eternity. I washed the breakfast dishes by hand, my movements slow and mechanical. I tidied the living room, folding the blanket we had shared in front of the fire, the faint scent of his cologne still clinging to the wool. Each small act was a penance. I was trying to restore order, to put things back the way they were, as if that could somehow rewind time and erase my monumental mistake. But the silence in the cabin was deafening. It was a void where last night's easy conversation and shared laughter had been. When he finally came back inside, he brought a gust of cold, pine-scented air with him. His face was unreadable. He took off his boots by the door, his movements still measured and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. He was going to say something. The polite but firm dismissal. "This was a mistake. Let's just forget last night happened. I think it's best if we maintain a professional relationship." I braced myself for the impact, steeling my nerves for the quiet, devastating blow. He walked over to the fireplace and poked at the embers, coaxing a few small flames back to life. He did this for a long time, his back to me. The tension in the room was a physical thing, a pressure against my eardrums. I couldn't bear it anymore. I had to say something, to break the spell, even if it meant confirming my worst fears. "Liam," I started, my voice barely a whisper. He stopped, his hand frozen on the poker. He straightened up slowly and turned to face me. His expression was serious, his dark eyes intense. "We need to talk." The 4 words I had been dreading. They landed like stones in the pit of my stomach. This was the preamble to the rejection. I nodded, unable to speak, and gestured to the sofa. We sat, not close like the night before, but at opposite ends, the space between us a vast, empty canyon. I stared at my hands, laced together so tightly my knuckles were white. I prepared myself for the end. He took a deep breath, the sound loud in the quiet room. "I've been quiet this morning," he began, his voice a low rumble. "And I'm sorry if that made you uncomfortable. I was just thinking." I risked a glance at him. He wasn't looking at me, but at the fire. "I'm not good at this, Elias," he said, his voice laced with a surprising vulnerability. "Talking about feelings. I'm much better with wood and stone. Things that fit together in a logical way." He finally turned his head and met my gaze. The raw honesty in his eyes made my breath catch. "Last night," he continued, his voice dropping even lower. "That wasn't a mistake. Not for me." He paused, letting the words sink in. My heart, which had been preparing for a fall, gave a hopeful, hesitant flutter. The opposite, actually. It was overdue. I stared at him, my mind struggling to process his words. "Overdue. This trip," he said, a faint, self-deprecating smile touching his lips. "The photographer isn't coming, Elias. I canceled him on Wednesday." Confusion washed over me, displacing the anxiety for a moment. "What? Why?" "Because I knew the storm was coming," he confessed, his gaze unwavering. "The forecast was clear it was going to be a big one. I engineered this. I wanted to get you up here, away from the city, away from our offices and conference tables. I wanted an excuse for us to be trapped together, where we might actually have to talk to each other like people, not just a client and a designer." The revelation was staggering. It reframed the entire weekend. The casual invitation, the storm, his calmness. It had all been deliberate. It wasn't an accident. It was a plan. My mind reeled. I've wanted to get to know you better since our very first meeting, he admitted, his cheeks flushing slightly. But I didn't know how. There was this professional line, and you seemed so self-contained, so reserved. I was afraid of crossing that line and making you uncomfortable. I was afraid of being wrong. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Turns out the guy who builds solid foundations is a coward when it comes to this stuff. He saw the lingering doubt in my eyes, the question I was too afraid to ask. You mentioned a while back that you heard me on the phone talking to Sarah, he said, addressing a misconception I had harbored for months, a piece of evidence for his unavailability. Sarah is my sister. Her husband just left her. I've been trying to help her out. Every single one of my assumptions, the carefully constructed reasons for his unattainability, crumbled to dust. He wasn't taken. He wasn't just being polite. He had feelings for me. He had gone to elaborate, almost ridiculous lengths to create a situation where those feelings could be explored. The relief was so sudden, so overwhelming, it felt like a physical release. It was as if I had been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. Liam, I said, my voice thick with emotion. I had to clear my throat. I thought I was the only 1 inch the confession was out before I could stop it. I've been admiring you from a distance since that first day. I thought it was completely impossible. I was so sure I was reading everything wrong. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, the one that always reached his eyes. The tension that had held him so rigidly seemed to melt away. He moved then, closing the distance between us on the sofa in an instant. He took my face in his large, warm hands, his thumbs gently stroking my cheekbones. You haven't read a single thing wrong, he murmured, his eyes searching mine. Not a single thing. And then he kissed me. It was nothing like the tentative, questioning energy of the night before. This was a kiss of certainty, of profound relief. It was deep and sure, a confirmation of everything that had just been said. It was the feeling of a foundation finally settling into place. It wasn't the chaos I had feared. It was the most solid, real thing I had ever felt. It was coming home. The rest of that morning was a gentle unfolding. The awkwardness had vanished completely, replaced by a quiet, tender intimacy that felt both brand new and deeply familiar. We rebuilt the fire, not for warmth, but for the simple pleasure of it. We sat on the rug, side by side this time, his arm draped easily around my shoulders, my head resting against his chest. I could feel the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my ear, a counterpoint to the soft patter of rain that had started again outside. We talked for hours, not about work, not about design, but about everything else. He told me about growing up in a small town, about his frustration with his father who never understood his desire to build things. I told him about my own quiet childhood, my retreat into books and art as a way to manage a world that always felt too loud, too chaotic. We were filling in the sketches of each other, adding color and shadow and depth, creating portraits that were far more real than the ones we had imagined. Every so often, he would just stop talking and look at me, a small, wondrous smile on his face, as if he couldn't quite believe I was real. And then he would lean in and kiss me again, slow and soft, a gentle reaffirming of our new reality. With every touch, every shared story, I could feel the last remnants of my old walls dissolving. The fear of vulnerability, the instinct to retreat into my orderly shell, was being replaced by a quiet, hopeful joy. It was a fragile feeling, but it was real. Late in the afternoon, the lights flickered on. The refrigerator hummed back to life. The modern world was intruding, signaling that our time in this isolated sanctuary was coming to an end. A small pang of sadness hit me. I didn't want to leave this bubble, this space where the rules of my old life didn't apply. Liam must have sensed my shift in mood. He squeezed my shoulder gently. It's okay, he murmured into my hair. This doesn't end when we get back to the city. This is just the beginning. The drive home was the mirror image of the drive up. The sky was clear, a pale, washed-out blue. The playlist was the same, but now the quiet, instrumental music didn't feel like a buffer against silence. It felt like a soundtrack. Liam drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the center console, his fingers intertwined with mine. The simple contact was a constant, warm reminder that the past 48 hours had not been a dream. Every so often, I would glance over at him. The sunlight caught the silver in his stubble, and the lines around his eyes. He was the same man I had secretly admired from across my conference table for months. The same magnificent, unattainable exhibit. But now he was real. He was attainable. He was holding my hand. The quiet, manageable ache of my secret admiration was gone, replaced by the vibrant, terrifying, wonderful reality of a shared feeling. When he pulled up in front of my apartment building, the place that had once been my fortress of solitude, it looked different. Smaller, less like a sanctuary, and more like just a place to sleep. He didn't just drop me off. He turned off the engine and turned to me, his expression serious again, but this time it was a soft, tender seriousness. "So," he said, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of my hand. "Dinner tomorrow night." It was a simple question, a normal question, but to me, it was everything. It was the promise that this connection existed outside the magical confines of the cabin and the storm. It was the first step onto our new, ungrid map. "I'd like that," I said, and the smile that broke across my face felt more genuine than any I had worn before. He leaned across the console and gave me one last, lingering kiss. "Good," he whispered against my lips. "I'll pick you up at 7. I stood on the sidewalk and watched him drive away, the warmth of his hand still tingling on mine. I looked up at my apartment window, at the straight lines and the ordered life waiting for me inside. For the first time, it didn't feel like a comfort. It felt like a cage I had built for myself. But now, the door was open. Liam hadn't just weathered the storm with me. He had been the storm. He was the beautiful, unpredictable chaos that had washed away my carefully drawn lines, leaving behind the potential for a new design, one that was messier, more vibrant, and infinitely more real. I had spent so long living my life behind glass, afraid to touch. But now I understood. The real art wasn't in the observing. It was in the risk of connection, in the terrifying, beautiful act of reaching out and finally being touched back.